Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
George R.R. Martin was asked in an interview with Rolling Stone what inspired him to write the Game of Thrones series. And he said he was influenced by both his love of the Lord of the Rings books and his frustrations with them. He said, Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all these orcs? In real life kings had real-life problems to deal with. Just being a good guy was not the answer. You had to make hard decisions. And before continuing, I want to acknowledge the long line of Park Avenue Synagogue rabbis who came before me, who, like me, have stood on this bima and also asked, what about all those orcs? But despite this fantastical framing, I think that George R.R. Martin was getting at something real, which is we don't often think about what happens after Happily Ever After, that we ignore the parts of the story or the history that aren't wrapped up in a neat little narrative bow. Take Hanukkah, which we just celebrated. If you were to write a book about the story of Hanukkah, what would the last page be? It'd be something like the oil burned for 8 days, and the Maccabees rededicated the temple, the end. But that would ignore the next chapter in the history books, which tells us that the Maccabees might have been great warriors, but they were terrible rulers, and their dynasty eventually collapsed because of their corruption and infighting. Very different ending, not as clean, but more real. This week's Torah portion, Vayigash, begins the culmination of the weeks-long saga of Joseph and his family, where Jacob is reunited with his son, who's not only alive, but promoted to Pharaoh's grand vizier. Joseph drops his disguise, embraces all his brothers and his father, scenes of weeping and joy. They all get to live together in Egypt and ride out the famine together. The end. It's an incredibly moving finale, or seeming finale. But that summary also ignores what came after the final act. After the curtain falls on the family reunion, the tail end of this week's Parsha comes two seemingly minor choices that Joseph makes that have profound implications for the Israelites and for us as Jews today. The first is when Joseph brings a few of his brothers as a delegation to Pharaoh to petition him to allow them to settle in the region of Goshen. And before they enter the royal chamber, Joseph warns them, don't tell him you're all shepherds. Egyptians look down on shepherds. I'm going to tell Pharaoh that you're livestock breeders. And when Pharaoh summons you and asks, what's your occupation? You shall answer, your servants have been livestock breeders from our youth until now, both us and our fathers. All shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians. I cannot stress this enough. Don't say that you're shepherds. So, delegation goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh asks them, what's their occupation? And what do the brothers say? We're shepherds. And not only are we shepherds, but we come from a long line of shepherds. Our father was our shepherd, and his father was a shepherd too. I like to think of this segment as one of the first examples of Jewish humor in the Torah. But the punchline obscures what's most interesting about the story, which is that Joseph was concerned about nothing. Immediately, Pharaoh welcomes them and says the Israelites can not only stay, but give the privilege to watch over his animals. So what was Joseph so worried about in the first place? Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch writes that Joseph had absorbed the Egyptian way of thinking about humanity. In Egypt, people were only defined by their jobs. When an Egyptian gave birth, Hirsch wrote, it wasn't actually a human being that was born, but a craftsman, or a farmer, or a warrior. That's how Joseph knew that Pharaoh's first question would be, what do you do for work? Because for Egyptians, that's all that mattered. So what caused Pharaoh to overcome this apparent aversion to shepherds? I think it was in both parts of the brothers' answer. Roetzon avadecha gam anachnu gam avotenu. We are shepherds, as were our fathers. In other words, they were saying, we have no reason to be ashamed of the work we do, but even so, our identities are not tied up in our jobs. Rather, an Israelite's identity is defined by their heritage, that they remember their history, and practice the ways of their ancestors. And it was that answer, that steadfast display of pride that impressed Pharaoh and convinced him to allow them to stay. The lesson from the brothers' answer to define yourself by who you are and not what office you work in or who signs your checks is an important one to remember in any context, but even more pressing today is the lesson to be publicly proud of who you are, despite those like Joseph who say that you should cover it up. The calls for Jews to hide aspects of their identity because it might make others upset, to tuck that chai necklace inside your shirt because it might make you a target, to not publicly advocate for Israel's right to defend itself on social media because you might get nasty DMs in response, to take down the giant menorah from the quad, as happened at Harvard this year, not because the college was concerned about the menorah possibly being vandalized, because they were concerned that the vandalism might make Harvard's PR problem worse. These calls for Jews to hide their identity must be met with the response of Joseph's brothers. This is who we are. This is who our people are, and we are no less deserving of respect because of it. And those within the Jewish community who, like Joseph, advocate for keeping shtum and saying what the powers that be want to hear so as to keep our privileged position in society, not make things worse, they have to reckon with the next section of Joseph's epilogue, which makes clear that he might not be someone whose behavior we should emulate. Unlike with Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, we actually know a lot about Joseph's financial policies. The story we tell in the more widely known part of the Joseph narrative is that he correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, predicting that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So he stockpiled grain in the bountiful years, so there would be enough to go around in the lean ones. But this vision of Joseph as this benevolent Norman Borlaug handing out food to all who need it is contradicted by the text of this week's Parsha, in which his policies actually seem quite exploitative. First of all, the Torah says he's not giving away the bread for free, as you might expect the government to do in times of natural disaster. He's making the Egyptians pay cash. And when they run out of cash, he makes them pay for food by selling their livestock. And when they run out of livestock, he makes them pay for food by selling their land to the government, except for the priests. And once almost all the land belongs to the government, he makes everyone sharecroppers who have to pay 20% in taxes, which historians say is low by the standard of the ancient Near East, but is still double the 10% tithe that the Torah says is due in a healthy and holy society. And not only that, but once there's no private property, it says, V'ha'am he'avir lo oto le'arim. He removed the population town by town so that no one could live in the area they once called home, and these policies persisted indefinitely, even after the famine crisis ended. The Torah in Leviticus says that an ethical society is one where if someone's forced to sell their land due to financial constraints, they get it back after 7 years. But in Joseph's Egypt, land was seized by eminent domain and never returned. When I first looked closely at this narrative, I was reminded of the Soviet Union, exploitative economic system, expropriation of private property, exiling of kulaks to remote locations. But almost unanimously, the classical rabbinic commentators only have praise for Joseph. They say that he made the tough but necessary decisions to make it possible for everyone to survive a natural disaster. Sforno says the use of rationing instead of food giveaways is the proper way to conduct oneself during periods of famine. Bechor Shor said his nationalization of land was praiseworthy because once the land belongs to the state, there can never be any more disputes over private property. These verses tell us Joseph's wisdom and greatness and understanding, said Ramban, because anyone else would have taken the profits from the food business and kept it for themselves, and instead Joseph reinvested them for the communal good. There's one possible exception, Rashbam, who points out that Joseph's policies of population transfer were also used by Sancheriv, the evil Assyrian king who tried to conquer Jerusalem. But given all the other praise, it's unclear whether comparing Joseph to the Genghis Khan of the ancient Near East is meant as a criticism or just as a historical analog. And it's worth pointing out that at the Torah itself, at the very end of the Parsha, the Egyptians say to Joseph, "You've saved our lives, we are grateful to you, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh." It's not for me to say whether Joseph's policies were right or wrong. I'm glad that I wasn't put in the position to make those calls. But even if we assume the best of intentions for Joseph, we still have to contend with the final verse of the Parsha. Thus Israel settled in the country of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. The rabbis explained that they acquired holdings means that they bought land, which, as we remember, was forbidden to all but a few Egyptians. And so once the famine was over and things had returned back to normal, an ordinary Egyptian who, let's remember, defines himself solely by their job and status, would have been demoted from landholder to serf, would have had their taxes raised by 20%, would have been forcibly resettled to a new city, and would have seen that the Israelites were not subject to these humiliations. It's after reading this epilogue that the first few lines of Exodus become much clearer. How could it have been that everyone so quickly forgot all that Joseph had done for Egypt, how he'd saved untold numbers of people from starvation and misery? Because even if every single impossible choice Joseph made in an impossible situation was the correct and ethical one, and even if the Egyptians remembered that and intellectually understood it, those memories would be overwhelmed by the memories of feelings. Feelings of sadness when being forcibly dispossessed while others could stay put. Feelings of being hungry while others had their needs supplied for them. Feelings of being humiliated while others were raised up. It's not hard to see echoes of those feelings today, distorted echoes, but echoes nonetheless. One of the reasons that productive public discourse about the war in Gaza has been so difficult is that there's almost always a mismatch where one side wants to talk about facts and the other side wants to talk about feelings, or vice versa. I can say that Israel's actions to defend itself from a genocidal terrorist organization are justified, that it has the obligation to eliminate the potential for more bombings and kidnappings, that like Joseph, it's doing the best it can in an impossible ethical situation in which the other side is not acting ethically. All of that can be true, and I believe are true, and also simply cannot provide an answer to someone reacting to the emotions that are evoked by the images of innocent Palestinian civilians who've been left homeless and suffering from starvation through no fault of their own. I can only speak for myself, but I've noticed over the past few months feelings of hard-heartedness, as if my concern for my fellow Jews has meant that there's no room for empathy for anyone else. How can it be that we're told to diminish our cups at the Passover Seder to mourn even Egyptian taskmasters and chariot drivers? And yet, I'm ashamed to admit, I found it difficult at times to make room in my prayers for children of Gaza who've committed no crime other than to be born under the auspices of one of history's most evil regimes. The lesson of the first Joseph story is that we have to have self-respect, be proud to be shepherds, be proud to be Jews. And part of that self-respect requires demanding that the world understand our feelings and our fears, our emotional ties to Israel and to Israelis, that they respect our feelings no less than they would respect the feelings of any other group. But the warning of the second Joseph story is that we're so consumed by engaging in intellectual justifications, no matter how correct they are, that we shut ourselves off from empathy entirely. If we privilege our own emotions over those of others who are also created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, then we will start down a path that will eventually lead the community in which we reside to totally disregard any empathy they might have had for us. In rabbinical school, when they teach you how to give sermons, they say that the ending is the most important part, that people might forget everything else, but they'll remember the last line, which you should try, if possible, to tie back to the beginning. It's very good advice, but it implies that endings can always be wrapped up neatly. That's a fantasy, like Lord of the Rings. It's not how life works. In real life, there's always another chapter. It's on us to consider and choose what facts and emotions we want to take with us as we write our own stories. Shabbat Shalom.